Well, I'm very connected to this idea of slowing people down, of constellating a different sense of time, is this device that I've been working with for some years now, which is the moving image Lightbox. It's kind of very akin to the 19th century magic lantern, pre-cinematic, artisanal, craft-based objects, where a still image is mechanically moved to create the illusion of movement. What's really interesting is that when people look at it, they think, oh, it's a video. And then they realize that it's not a video, but then what is it? It's a moving image. And in a sense, the repetition should mean that people, having seen one loop, move on. But precisely the opposite happens. You get slowed down, you enter that repetitive movement, and through that you begin to think and absorb and relate to that, because you have entered another kind of attention. So the moving image light boxes, which I keep swearing I'm going to stop making them, because I made too many now, but they work in this very special way. And what I've been doing with them is really looking at the ways in which we image the earth, so basically landscape traditions. And I see landscape, modes of imaging landscape as a quite potent revealer of our relationship to the earth. So if we move from classical Chinese ink and brush, Song Dynasty landscape painting, to satellite imagery, there is a whole shift of worldview, of perception, of ways of actually picturing the world that we inhabit. So in a sense, the world as picture. And there are huge shifts. Today with the mobile phone, everybody is producing images and in a sense imaging the world. And our images of the earth itself have grown far more distant. It's curious because we are more connected than we've ever been, but the images we use, whether it's a Google map or whether it's a satellite image, actually involve a kind of distancing from the materiality of the earth. So I work with this particular end of landscape. I work with the historical range as well in other works, but in the Edible Birds series, I work with satellite images of ecological disasters, and they look beautiful. It is such a bizarre feeling. You're looking at this image which shows this devastating earthquake, and it is an extraordinary image. And so you look at the beauty of the image and in a sense get abstracted from the concrete material reality of not just of the suffering that happened at the time of the earthquake, but what it means in terms of what we're doing to the earth. So I use images from 3 sites of disasters: the Gangetic floodplain, which is a recurrent site of flooding, Bangladesh, parts of India, and Myanmar, erstwhile Burma, which is prone to severe drought. I juxtapose these forms of landscape and these sites of disaster with the human body, the body working with another kind of relationship to the earth. From yoga, the asanas, the postures of yoga developed out of very careful observation of natural life. So many of the poses are based on animal movements, bird movements, and I don't mean just movement, but breathing, an entire way of being. So I work with the postures that are based on birds, and this has a kind of continuity with a previous work that this work extends out of, called Winged Pilgrims, A Chronicle from Asia, which really works with birds as a metaphor for this relationship between human beings and the earth and for the spirit. I work with the Garudasan. The Garud is a hybrid figure, partly bird, partly mammal. I work with the Pinchamayurasana, which is an inverted asana, and I work with Kukut and Kak. Now these all sound very exotic, but Kukut and Kak are crow and rooster. So they're basically postures that have developed from understanding the principles of the movement of energy and mobility of these creatures, and then drawn into the human body, which reenacts them to work with this body in a different way, because perhaps we have all those creatures within us as well. So you see this figure standing against this satellite image. It is the site of a disaster, but your first encounter with it is of a very interesting image of the landscape. And it's only when you read the caption that you realize that it's a disaster site. And mediating between the two is a moving layer. And these are quite slow, even slower than the winged pilgrims. So the layer almost seems to make, the layer carries edible birds, which is why the series is named Edible Birds, chickens, pheasants, battery hens. And it's almost like the real material interface between ourselves and the earth we inhabit is through what we consume. And that consumption itself has gotten distanced from the earth. Winged Pilgrims was provoked by the huge culling of birds in the wake of Asian avian flu, which was actually produced by absolutely brutal breeding conditions, because the virus is carried by all birds always, and it only becomes dangerous when you do that kind of poultry farming. So it's a peculiar irony that makes toxic what was a natural form of connection. So this sets up a kind of tension between the human figure, which is absorbed and accessed an understanding of another creature in a different way through the yogic pose. The earth, which is devastated but rendered beautiful, and the bird that we consume. So these three set up a kind of tension between each other to make us think about where we stand today and to think about this relationship. So it tries to open up that kind of question. It's quite eerie to watch the chickens moving over the body in the yogic pose, kind of melting into the body and melting into the landscape and coming in and out of it. So it creates something which is quite pleasurable to look at, but also very uncomfortable. And I do wish to create that discomfort, and I believe in beauty. I think beauty is important, but beauty needs to be honored for what it can open up. There's a powerful modernist rejection of beauty. There's a whole postmodernist critique on over-aestheticized, especially if you come from a culture with a very highly developed aesthetic theory and aesthetic tradition. Contemporary artists reject beauty. And this is something that I'm continuously engaging with in different ways. I think beauty is very important to, in fact, provoke the viewer into thinking about things that are really not very beautiful. So this kind of touches on consumption, but in a more philosophic way. The edible birds. It's going to a deeper sense of the forms of relation. When we come into bogieroog, which means consumption disease, there are multiple shifts. There's a huge shift in technology. So from the kind of artisanal, handmade moving image Lightbox, you shift to something that uses quite high-end software, kind of virtual reality experience. The work is, you enter, I always end up describing the experience of the work rather than as a way of speaking about it, because it is constructed as an experience that would perhaps lead to certain kinds of thinking and transformations. You enter a booth where you see yourself as if in a mirror. You're standing in a field of beautiful mustard flowers, and slowly the field changes and you go through a cycle of transformations. The transformations are all to do with ordinary food. So we are looking actually at all the foods that are facing or have already undergone genetic engineering. In India, there's a huge debate right now over allowing or not allowing genetic modification. We've had a terrible experience with allowing BT, biotechnology, cotton, which led to huge suicides and major farmer suicides and debt, because the cycle of buying GM seeds being uncontrollable, them spreading, getting dependent on high irrigation, high fertilizer, all of which has to be purchased, led to a situation where farmers could not see themselves releasing themselves from the burden of debt for their lifetime. So they killed themselves. So we've been through that. So there's a powerful farmers' lobby, and of course the ecological activists and the green movement that is resisting the coming in of genetic modification, especially on food. There is an equally powerful lobby with politicians and scientists and corporations such as Monsanto, who are arguing the usual argument of greater production, you can feed more people, cheaper food, etc. The bill is tabled in Parliament and there's a moratorium. It's hanging fire. So it's very, I made the piece a year and a half ago, which is when this whole issue exploded. It's still not clear how it will go. There's a lot of unacknowledged random testing going on without people's permission or knowledge. There's an attempt to set up an autonomous body, which would be the GM Regulatory Authority, which would not be answerable to Parliament, which is a problem. The corporations, one of the ministers filed his statement in Parliament, and it was, you could find the same text on the Monsanto site. So it's terrifying. It is truly terrifying. So it's a kind of crucial debate, but one that seems far away from people's day-to-day lives. Combined with that is a kind of boom in consumption that we're looking at in India. There's a proliferation of malls, of brands, of a kind of consumerist culture that is fairly new for us, but has exploded. In this context, I felt that I wanted to find a way that could get people to think about food, about what they eat, and about the dangers and threats of genetic modification, but in a performative way that would make them feel that this was happening to themselves and not that this was not a political issue in the newspapers happening over there, nothing to do with me, particularly young people, because I think they're going to be quite important deciders of how this policy goes. So the work is designed to playfully, performatively, it uses the natural narcissism of us as a species. We like looking at ourselves, so you look at yourself, you enjoy that, and then things start happening to you. And you go through this cycle, which slowly gets a little more difficult and a little more uncomfortable, ending up with something that leads you to the possibility, which is not technically far in the future, which is of designer babies, genetic cloning of the creation of human beings through genetic manipulation. The work is meant to play with the sense of self and remind oneself that the body is the self, because there's another split that is happening there between the body and the self. So it's bringing body-self together through the metaphor of food and what we ordinarily consume. It's very basic things. It's mustard oil, it's rice, it's tomatoes, it's aubergines. These are all the foods that are facing genetic modification. The experiences of setting this up, because in a sense it's essentially a public art project, and that's how it began. And the first place was a community center, which was very interesting because these were more working class people and had a quite different relationship to the work. They were regulars, they'd come back every evening to play. And they asked questions, and they really got into this business of you are what you eat, and what's happening to food, and how food has changed, etc. The next place was the belly of the beast inside a shopping mall. And that was very interesting because I had something like 9,000 to 10,000 people go through the work in a day, which was extraordinary, but I would say 50% of them basically stopped at the first level. As soon as they realized that you see yourself on the screen and you are also being seen outside, they would quickly find a way of photographing this, get someone to take a picture of them or photograph themselves, and then it was over. So in a sense, the work was reconsumed by half the people. For the others who stayed through the cycles of transformations, intrigued, puzzled, confused, it was almost like a performative enactment of the statement that the work makes. Not necessarily because the visitors or the viewers were aware of this, but they were somehow implicated in this. So that became quite an interesting way of reading this work. I mean, these are both directions which are somewhat different from the didactic intention. I mean, that happened. But I deliberately chose not to have pamphlets, not to have handouts which would explain things, because I really wanted to come through that performative cycle of 5 minutes where you're looking at yourself in the mirror and you change, which in itself is quite an interesting, slightly destabilized place. And the destabilizing can open up a lot of things. So I think in a gallery context and a museum context where it's also been shown, it's a far more controlled space, and in a way a far more reflective space. So this is the most satisfying place, despite it being designed as a public project, because it's the perfect kind of public space. It is public, it is genuinely open to everybody, but the people who come in with a genuine desire to engage with work and are not necessarily passerbys who are just looking for the next thrill in the mall or whatever. So it's a work that continues to travel, and I'm watching it very carefully. I think I'm learning an enormous amount about public art, about notions of public space, and about the trickiness of playing with that narcissistic edge. It can be very powerful, it can also be quite tricky. So that's where I'm at with that work.